Under the grand glass facade of the UN building, world leaders have once again gathered for the annual General Assembly, a moment when nations large and small step forward to define their priorities and warn of dangers they see threatening the global order. On this September morning, all eyes turned toward one of Latin America's most seasoned political figures, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, the president of Brazil. At 79, Lula is no newcomer to these halls. He has addressed the General Assembly multiple times across his decades in politics, positioning Brazil as a voice for the global South, a defender of the Amazon, and a champion of social justice. But this year, his words carried a different weight. Lula used his time at the podium to launch a clear warning that democracies everywhere are under attack. His speech was direct, uncompromising, and pointed. Quoting in Portuguese, he declared, "Across the world, anti-democratic forces are trying to subjugate institutions and suppress freedoms." For Lula, this was not abstract rhetoric. It was a direct reference to the events that shook his own country less than 3 years ago, when, on January 8, 2023, a mob of supporters of his predecessor, Jair Bolsonaro, stormed Brazil's Congress, Supreme Court, and presidential palace in Brasilia. It was an extraordinary assault on democratic institutions, one that echoed the January 6th attack on the US Capitol 2 years earlier. Those scenes of smashed windows, broken furniture, and rioters draped in flags remain fresh in the memory of Brazilians, and for Lula, they are a permanent reminder of how fragile democratic order can be. At the United Nations, he connected Brazil's ordeal to a larger pattern that spans continents. He accused what he called anti-democratic forces of seeking to manipulate societies, undermine courts, and silence the press. In his words, these are movements that thrive on disinformation, exploit political polarization, and seek to roll back the freedoms hard-won over decades. His comments were not limited to Brazil's domestic politics. Lula stressed that foreign interference through covert financing, disinformation campaigns, and cyber manipulation is becoming a dangerous new weapon against democracies. While he did not name countries directly, his words echoed concerns expressed by Western intelligence agencies about Russia's role in election interference, and more broadly, about the ability of authoritarian states to amplify extremist voices abroad. For delegates listening in the Grand Chamber, Lula's message cut through a week dominated by discussions of war, climate change, and economic uncertainty. His speech was a stark reminder that the very foundation of international cooperation, the belief in democratic legitimacy, is itself being shaken. Lula has long cultivated the image of a survivor. Born into poverty in Brazil's northeast, he rose from being a factory worker and union leader to the presidency in 2003. His Workers' Party governed for over a decade, lifting millions out of poverty through social programs like Bolsa Familia. Yet his career has also been marked by imprisonment and political battles. Returning to power in 2023 after a contentious election against Jair Bolsonaro, Lula faced not only political opposition, but also violent attempts to discredit and overturn his mandate. This personal history gave urgency to his words at the United Nations. His call was not only about institutions, but also about the human cost of democratic backsliding. Around the world, journalists have been jailed, judges intimidated, and opposition voices silenced. For Lula, these are not isolated cases, but symptoms of a deeper global malaise. At the General Assembly, Lula reminded the international community that Brazil's democracy withstood the storm, thanks to the independence of its judiciary and the resilience of its civil society. But he insisted that such resilience cannot be taken for granted. Institutions must be defended every day, he said, warning that authoritarian movements feed on apathy as much as they do on anger. Delegates in the hall, from European democracies struggling with far-right movements to African nations confronting coups to Asian states balancing populism and authoritarian resurgence, understood the relevance of his message. Lula's intervention also carried a subtle rebuke to countries accused of meddling in Brazil's domestic politics. During the 2022 campaign, Bolsonaro and his allies often cast doubt on the legitimacy of Brazil's electronic voting system, a narrative amplified on social media platforms and supported by networks of disinformation. For Lula, standing at the UN, This was a chance to reaffirm that Brazil's institutions had stood firm and to demand respect for national sovereignty. Yet his message was also outward-looking. He framed the defence of democracy as a global responsibility, one that requires cooperation across borders. In doing so, he echoed Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, who in his opening speech warned that trust in democratic systems is collapsing worldwide. This convergence of voices, the Brazilian president and the Portuguese UN chief, underscored a growing consensus that the erosion of democracy is not confined to any single country, but is becoming a structural global challenge. For Lula, the stakes are personal, but also geopolitical. Brazil, under his leadership, has sought to play a larger role in mediating international disputes, from the war in Ukraine to the political crisis in Venezuela. By casting himself as a defender of democracy, Lula seeks to strengthen Brazil's credibility as a mediator and a global player. His critics, however, argue that Lula's record is not without contradictions. While he champions democracy at the UN, he has also maintained close ties with governments accused of authoritarian practices, including Venezuela, Cuba and Nicaragua. This tension was not addressed in his speech, but it lingers in the background of Brazil's foreign policy. Still, Lula's decision to put democracy at the centre of his address signals a broader calculation, that in a world divided by geopolitical rivalries, defending institutions can be a unifying message. For countries weary of great power competition, Lula's words offered a reminder that the survival of democratic systems may be the most urgent global cause. The applause that followed his remarks was polite but pointed. Diplomats nodded as he concluded, understanding the wider implications. The UN stage is often filled with lofty declarations, but Lula's warning carried the weight of lived experience. A nation that nearly lost its democratic order, and a president who returned from political exile to defend it. The symbolism of Lula's presence was also important. Just 2 years earlier, Bolsonaro used the same platform to question vaccines, criticise international institutions and align Brazil with far-right causes. Today, Lula presented a sharp contrast, a leader positioning Brazil as a bulwark against extremism rather than a contributor to it. In the corridors outside the chamber, reactions varied. Some Latin American delegates praised Lula's stand, calling it a necessary reminder of the threats facing the region. European diplomats drew parallels to the rise of far-right parties across the continent. American officials, still dealing with the aftermath of January 6th, noted the resonance of Lula's words with their own domestic struggles. Ultimately, Lula's UN speech will be remembered less for its length than for its clarity. In an era when global institutions face skepticism, when social media accelerates disinformation, and when leaders themselves sometimes flirt with authoritarian impulses, his call to defend democracy cut through the noise. As the Brazilian flag was lowered outside the UN at the end of the day's session, Lula's words remained, a reminder that democracy is not self-sustaining and that vigilance is required to protect freedoms that can be eroded in an instant. For Brazil, the struggle continues at home, with political polarization, economic inequality and environmental challenges all testing the durability of institutions. For the world, Lula's warning echoes as part of a broader chorus that the battle for democracy is global, urgent and unfinished. From New York, this is the story of a president who came to the United Nations not simply to speak for his country, but to remind the world that the defense of democracy is everyone's fight. Across the world, anti-democratic forces are trying to subjugate institutions and suppress freedoms.
Cultua a violência.